I didn't understand what was happening to me at first. Nothing dramatic happened, no shouting, no threats, just a quiet shift in the way my world felt, like the ground had moved slightly under my feet, and I was the only one who noticed. When I joined that company, I was already tired of surviving. I wasn't chasing success or ambition. I just needed stability, a paycheck, something predictable. So when my boss noticed my work and treated me with respect, I trusted him without hesitation. That trust felt natural, safe. He was admired by everyone, calm, intelligent, well-respected, the kind of man people believed instantly. In meetings, his words carried weight. In the office, no one questioned his intentions. I remember thinking how lucky I was to work under someone so professional. At first, nothing felt wrong. He was friendly, supportive, always checking in. Then the comments started, small ones, easy to dismiss. He would say I looked stressed, that I should relax around him, that he wouldn't tell anyone. I laughed them off, because questioning them felt unnecessary, almost rude. Then he started knowing things I never told him. Personal details, my rent situation, my past job issues, things I had never shared at work. I told myself it was coincidence, because the alternative was terrifying. I wanted to believe I was safe. One evening, after most people had left, he asked me to stay late. He said it was a small favor, nothing serious. The office felt unusually quiet. He closed the door and handed me a sealed envelope, telling me to keep it safe and return it the next day. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about the envelope felt wrong, but I kept convincing myself I was overthinking. I needed this job. I needed things to stay normal. The next morning, when I tried to give it back, he smiled and calmly told me to hold on to it longer. Later that night, my phone buzzed, an unknown number. The message said he knew what I was holding. My heart started racing. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't even opened the envelope. Another message followed, warning me that curiosity could ruin lives. When I finally opened it, my body went cold. Inside were private things from my past, things that could destroy my reputation if they were shared. I sat there in silence, realizing someone I trusted had access to parts of my life I never gave permission to touch. That was the moment everything became clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a favor. It was a setup, and if I didn't comply, the cost wouldn't just be my job, it would be everything I had left. After that night, nothing needed to be said out loud. He didn't threaten me. He didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. The fear did all the work for him. Every time I walked into the office, I felt it sitting in my chest, reminding me that my life was no longer fully mine. He started treating me differently, not worse, better, too carefully, like someone protecting an investment. He would lower his voice when talking to me, ask if I was feeling okay, tell me he appreciated my loyalty. Each word sounded kind, but none of them felt safe. The messages continued, not often, just enough. A reminder here, a comment there. He never asked for anything extreme. That was the worst part. It was always something small, staying late, covering for him, keeping quiet during meetings, things that sounded harmless but slowly boxed me in. I became hyper-aware of everything I did, every email I sent, every conversation I had. I started rereading my own messages, wondering how they could be twisted if someone wanted to hurt me. I stopped talking about my personal life entirely. Silence felt like protection. What scared me most was how calm he was. He never seemed rushed, never nervous, like he knew time was on his side, like he understood that fear grows on its own when you give it space, and I was giving it plenty. One day, he casually mentioned how fragile reputations are. He talked about people losing everything over rumors, careers ending because of a single story. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. I knew exactly who he was talking to. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that I was overreacting, that powerful people don't need to blackmail others. But deep down, I knew the truth. He wasn't powerful because of his position. He was powerful because he understood fear better than I did. I stopped sleeping properly. I started waking up with my heart racing, replaying conversations in my head. I wondered what would happen if I quit, if I disappeared, if I told someone. And every time the same thought stopped me. Who would believe me? To everyone else, he was still the same respected boss, calm, reliable, trustworthy. And I was just an employee, replaceable, easy to doubt. I realized then that this wasn't just about what he had on me. It was about who people would choose to believe. By the end of that month, I understood something terrifying. I wasn't waiting for him to do something. I was waiting for permission to breathe. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more power he had over me. And then he asked for something that crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I knew something was coming. I could feel it in the way he watched me. Not directly, not obviously, but with patience, like someone waiting for the right moment to move. The first real request came disguised as trust. He told me he needed help with something sensitive, something that could not involve anyone else. He said I was reliable, that I understood discretion better than most people. I didn't answer immediately. My silence annoyed him, I could tell, not because he raised his voice, but because his kindness disappeared. The warmth in his tone flattened, and suddenly the room felt smaller. He reminded me, calmly, that people talk, that stories grow on their own, that once something is said, it can never be taken back. He said all of this like advice, like he was protecting me from myself. That was the moment I realized he wasn't asking, he was collecting obedience. I tried to push back gently. I told him I wasn't comfortable, that it didn't feel right. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, but my voice stayed controlled. I thought maybe if I sounded reasonable, he would stop. He smiled, leaned back in his chair and said he understood. Then he mentioned my name the way people do when they are disappointed, slow, deliberate, heavy. He brought up one detail from the envelope, just one, not enough to expose me, but enough to remind me it existed, enough to let me know he hadn't forgotten, enough to make my stomach turn. After that, everything changed. The requests became more personal, more invasive. He framed them as favors, but they came with reminders attached, subtle warnings, small comments that followed me home and echoed in my head at night. I started avoiding mirrors, avoiding people, avoiding myself. I felt like I was shrinking, like my entire life had narrowed down to one question: how do I keep this from getting worse? The worst part was how alone I felt. I couldn't talk to co-workers. I couldn't talk to friends. I couldn't talk to family. Because the story sounded unbelievable even to me. Powerful people don't do this. Good bosses don't behave this way. That's what everyone believes. And he knew silence would protect him, not me. One afternoon, as I was leaving his office, he said something that finally broke through the fog. He told me that loyalty is remembered and resistance is documented. He said it casually, like a joke, but it landed like a threat. That was when I understood I was no longer dealing with a man testing boundaries. I was dealing with someone who believed he owned them. And I knew if I didn't make a decision soon, I would disappear inside this fear completely. After that conversation, the fear stopped feeling abstract. It became practical, measurable, something I had to manage every day. He didn't rush anymore. He didn't need to. He had already proven that he could reach into my life whenever he wanted. So instead of pressure, he used routine. Meetings were scheduled without notice, favors were expected without explanation, and silence was treated like agreement. I learned quickly that hesitation only made things worse. He started isolating me, not openly, but strategically. Projects were reassigned, co-workers stopped looping me into conversations, and when I asked questions, I was told to focus on my own responsibilities. I could feel the narrative forming around me, not hostile, not aggressive, just distant, like I was slowly becoming irrelevant, and irrelevant people are easy to replace. One day, I overheard him laughing with someone about loyalty. about how some people forget who helped them succeed. He didn't say my name, but he didn't need to. That night, another message came. Short, calm, efficient, reminding me that stability is fragile and gratitude is remembered. It felt less like a threat and more like a summary. I started making choices based on fear without realizing it, canceling plans, avoiding calls, dressing differently, speaking less. Every decision was filtered through one question: will this upset him? The worst part was how normal everything looked from the outside. No drama, no scenes, no evidence, just a woman slowly disappearing behind politeness and compliance. I thought about quitting again, seriously this time. I imagined walking away, starting over, but every version of that future ended the same way, with my past following me. He understood that too. He began mentioning consequences without describing them, saying things like "people talk" or "stories have a way of resurfacing." His words were vague, but the meaning was precise. Then came the moment that changed everything. He asked me to lie for him. Not a big lie, not something illegal, just a small distortion, something easy to deny later. He said it would protect both of us. He said this was how trust works. That was the line. Because once I lied, I would no longer be a victim, I would be an accomplice, and he knew it. I left his office knowing I was running out of time. Either I stayed silent and disappeared completely, or I did something that would make everything explode. And the truth was, he was no longer the only one holding power. I didn't sleep after that day. My mind kept replaying his words, the way he framed the lie like a favor, like protection, like loyalty. He made it sound harmless, but I knew exactly what it was. If I lied for him, I would no longer be someone trapped, I would be someone involved. And once that line is crossed, there is no clean way back. The next morning, I walked into the office already knowing I couldn't keep pretending. My body felt heavy, my thoughts felt sharp. Fear had turned into something else, something quieter but stronger. He noticed immediately, he always did. He asked if I was all right, if something was wrong. His concern sounded real enough to fool anyone listening. I told him I needed clarity. I said I was uncomfortable, that I didn't feel safe with what he was asking. My voice stayed calm, but my hands were shaking. For the first time, his expression changed. Not anger, not surprise, but calculation, like someone adjusting a plan. He leaned forward and reminded me again how easily misunderstandings become stories, how quickly stories become truths. He said it softly, like he was offering guidance. Then he did something different. He named a consequence. He didn't describe it fully. He just mentioned a person, someone I respected, someone whose opinion mattered, and said it would be unfortunate if they heard the wrong version of events. That was when I realized the situation had evolved. This was no longer about control. It was about containment. I walked away from that conversation, knowing something had shifted. He wasn't confident anymore. He was cautious, and cautious people make mistakes. I started documenting everything, messages, dates, times, tone, patterns, not because I had a plan, but because silence had stopped feeling safe. For the first time, fear wasn't the loudest thing in my head. Anger was, not explosive anger, but steady, focused, patient. I understood then that he had underestimated one thing. He believed fear would keep me quiet forever. He didn't realize fear eventually turns into resolve. And once that happens, the balance of power changes. Because people who have nothing left to protect are no longer easy to control. After that realization, nothing felt theoretical anymore. The moment fear turned into resolve, the situation stopped being static. I could feel movement around me, not obvious, not loud, but deliberate, like pieces on a board shifting into place. The documentation I had started quietly became my anchor. Dates, messages, tone, patterns, all of it began forming a picture that even I could no longer ignore. And the more complete that picture became, the harder it was to pretend this was misunderstanding or paranoia. He sensed the change in me before I said anything. I could see it in the way he watched more closely, spoke more carefully, tested reactions instead of issuing reminders. The casual confidence from before was gone, replaced by something tighter, more alert. At work, the pressure changed shape. It stopped being personal and became procedural. Sudden performance check-ins, vague feedback, comments about attitude and alignment. Nothing concrete enough to challenge, but enough to establish a record. I understood what he was doing. He was preparing a shield, something official, something that could be pointed to later, a way to frame me as unstable or difficult if I ever spoke. What surprised him was that I stopped reacting. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself, I didn't try to explain. I listened, noted, documented, and walked away, and that lack of response unsettled him more than resistance ever could. The fear that once lived in my chest had moved somewhere else. It was still there, but it no longer controlled my decisions. Instead, it sharpened them, and I realized that as long as I was reacting emotionally, he had leverage. But the moment I became predictable only to myself, the balance shifted. Then something happened that neither of us could control. A situation arose that required outside involvement, not because I spoke up, but because circumstances forced scrutiny. And suddenly there were questions being asked that neither silence nor reputation could fully answer. I saw it in his behavior immediately. The careful calm fractured, the patience thinned, the need to manage perception became visible, and that was when I knew the situation had crossed into a phase where outcomes would no longer be private. From that moment forward, I wasn't just protecting myself, I was preparing for impact, because once systems start looking closely, they do not stop easily, and people who rely on silence rarely survive attention. And I understood something else too. The power he thought he held was already weakening, not because he had lost control completely, but because control only works when fear is unquestioned, and mine no longer was. Once outside attention entered the situation, even indirectly, the dynamic shifted in ways I could feel immediately. Conversations became guarded, decisions were delayed, and the quiet certainty he once carried was replaced by constant calculation, like someone trying to stay ahead of a story that was no longer fully theirs. He began speaking to me again more often, not with threats, not with reminders, but with reassurance, telling me how misunderstandings happen, how stressful environments create false narratives, how loyalty during difficult moments is always remembered. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. He was no longer commanding silence, he was trying to manage it. At the same time, the environment around me grew heavier. Whispers followed me through hallways, meetings included careful glances, and I could tell people sensed tension even if they did not understand its source. When silence spreads through a group, it rarely stays neutral. What I did not expect was how quickly control turns desperate once it is challenged. Small mistakes on his part began to surface, contradictions in tone, inconsistencies in decisions, moments where his version of events no longer aligned perfectly with records or timelines. I stayed quiet through all of it, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Every interaction was observed, every word weighed, every response measured, because reacting emotionally would only restore the balance he wanted. Then came the moment that made everything irreversible. He confronted me privately, not with anger, but with urgency, asking what I wanted, what it would take to make this go away. His language was careful, but the message was clear. He no longer believed silence was guaranteed. That was when I understood the truth of the situation. This had never been about me making mistakes or needing protection. It had been about control, and once that control was threatened, the person who relied on it lost stability. I told him nothing, offered nothing, promised nothing, and walked away knowing the line between private pressure and public consequence had already been crossed. From that point forward, it was no longer about what he could do to me. It was about what the truth would do to him. And for the first time since this began, I felt something other than fear. I felt certainty. Once that certainty settled in, the fear I had carried for so long stopped controlling me. Not because it disappeared, but because it no longer decided my actions. I understood that whatever happened next would hurt, but staying silent would hurt forever. The process moved slowly, quietly, but relentlessly. Questions were asked, records were reviewed, timelines were compared, and what had once relied on implication and silence began to collapse under scrutiny, because manipulation does not survive examination. He tried to hold his position together, maintaining calm in public while scrambling in private, but the control he depended on required complete silence, and silence was no longer available to him. People began noticing the inconsistencies, not because I shouted, not because I accused, but because the story he had built could not support its own weight once attention shifted toward it. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive dramatically, it arrived clinically, through documentation, through patterns, through questions he could not answer cleanly, and that made it impossible to dismiss. The moment accountability entered the room, everything changed. Reputation, authority, and power stopped being shields and became liabilities. I watched from a distance as consequences unfolded, not with satisfaction, not with celebration, but with a quiet sense of closure. Because justice is rarely loud, and healing does not need applause. What surprised me most was not his fall, but my own relief, the realization that my life no longer revolved around managing someone else's fear, that my future was no longer being negotiated in silence. I did not win something, I reclaimed it. My voice, my choices, my name, and when it was over, when the pressure finally lifted, I understood the truth that had taken me so long to accept. Control only survives in darkness. The moment light appears, it begins to fail, and silence, no matter how powerful it feels, is never stronger than truth.